Hi guys, and welcome back. In today's video, we're going to be talking all about SIBO diets. We're going to talk the pros, the cons, the similarities, the dissimilarities, and finally, what I recommend to my patients with SIBO as a clinician when we have the need for dietary symptomatic support. And that is key. Notice that I did not say that these diets treat SIBO. And notice that I said dietary symptomatic management. So no, you're not going to kill the SIBO. You're not going to eradicate the SIBO by starving it with these diets. That is not something that has been supported in research, and it has not been supported by my clinical experience. But if you are severely compromised from your SIBO, if you are really inflamed and really bloated and just struggling with diarrhea and struggling with brain fog, it can be so tremendously helpful to give your body a break and reduce these fermentable carbohydrates and fibers for a short period of time, maybe a couple weeks or a couple months, in order to get the symptoms to improve and lower your inflammation and get some clarity. And then that will buy us time to work on the root causes of why you got SIBO. But please, please, please don't get lost in this world of like, you can kill the SIBO, you can eradicate it, just starve it, because that is not something that's supported with research. And it really, that mentality is a very slippery slope, both for clinicians and patients, and it's usually not a very fruitful road to go down in my experience. So without further ado, let me go ahead and share my screen. Let's start off with plain old, good old low FODMAP. And you can see that in my handout here, I've broken it down via the FODMAP acronym. So fermentable, oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. And we break down the foods that are in each. The reason why I do that for my handout that I give patients is because when we go into the reintroduction phase, it can be a very useful strategy to look through this and say, all right, which foods are only in one category? So say like cauliflower, only in the polyol category. Mango, I think really only shows up in the fructose category. And then you can go about your reintroduction in a very systematic, scientific way where, say, you try foods that only contain polyols. So let's say, I'm just kind of picking at random here, lychee, and they go fine. If one polyol-containing food goes okay, then there's a higher likelihood that the other polyol-containing foods are going to go okay. So you can kind of pick up some speed, pick up some momentum going through your reintroduction. Then you can hop over to the next category, so say fructose, and you can start knocking off fructose-containing foods, and then you can hop over, and you can go about it in this systematic way where you do one category at a time until finally you are left with the foods that are in multiple categories, like apple or perhaps beans, and you could go about it really quite scientifically. So I like to break it down via the FODMAP acronym, but certainly there's probably other handouts out there in the internet too. Oh, and as a side note, if you guys want this handout or the other one I'm about to show you, I'll put a link in the doobly-doo down below. Just click on that link and you'll be led to a spot where you can request those. Just let me know where to send them. Let me know your email address and then I'll send them to you. I'm happy to share these handouts because they're really handy and they're little one-page printable handouts. But anyway, so this is a little glimpse at low FODMAP. I know I have other videos on that diet, but you can get a sense for how many foods you end up restricting or eliminating on low FODMAP. But you actually do have a few options, more than a few. You have quite a few options of foods that you can enjoy when you're doing low FODMAP. So you can see over here, things like okra, olives, papaya, pawpaws. Those are a southern United States fruit that I only have recently become acquainted with. Clementines, cantaloupe, you could do quinoa and oats, you could do, edamame, brown lentils, you could do some dairy. Even some sugars are readily digested by the human body and therefore are unlikely to feed the SIBO, quote unquote. So you actually have quite a few options of what you can eat. And again, you're welcome to have this handout. Just let me know where to send it and I will happily email this to you. And just follow the link in the doobly-doo to do that. But yeah, so you can see that there's quite a lot that you restrict on this diet, but you're still left with quite a few foods that you're able to enjoy. And some of them are going to be dose dependent. So for example, cabbage can be okay as long as you have less than a cup. Red cabbage if it's less than a cup and a half. Zucchini, if you stick at or below about a half a cup of zucchini, you're a-okay. But if you have, 3/4 of a cup or more, you're probably looking at a high FODMAP food now because the quantity matters. Remember, for FODMAP content and starch and fiber, quantity really, really matters. So you'll notice that some of these foods have some quantities next to them. So say if you eat snow peas, but you only eat 5 or 6 pods, that's low FODMAP, so that would be okay usually. So you can kind of get a sense for how this diet can be modified, and it's not just a strict avoid everything on this sheet, eat everything on this sheet kind of a game. Now let's move into another really popular SIBO diet, and that is from the SIBOinfo.com website. So this is from Allison Siebecker. She's a naturopath who has a lot of experience with SIBO. There are some things that I would dispute or take issue with on this particular page of her website, but I'm not gonna make it about that. What I will just share really quickly before I get into the diet itself is that she has some bullet points here that you can use diet as the main treatment for SIBO or the only treatment for SIBO, and I vehemently disagree with that. It is managing symptoms, it is mitigating symptoms, but it's not actually treating the SIBO itself. It's not treating the reasons why you got SIBO, the so-called root causes, and it's not treating the actual state of dysbiosis in and of itself. It's just keeping it quiet so that it's not making you miserable with symptoms. But symptomatic management and actual treatment of the thing are two different scenarios. So I would argue that you can manage symptoms usually fairly well with one of these restricted diets, but you're not actually treating the SIBO, and that's a very key differentiation to make. I do agree with these 2 points. You can use diet in combination with antibiotics or antimicrobials, although it's not always necessary, and you can use it as a therapy to just allow your GI lining to heal itself. That is particularly true for the more long-standing or really, really wicked cases of SIBO that are really, really badly overgrown. And I would also dispute this last point, that you can use these diets as a relapse prevention measure, and that she goes as far as to say that it is encouraged. I disagree with this. The reason you got SIBO is not because you were eating soluble fiber and prebiotics or even sugar. I don't think the reason you got SIBO, unless you're diabetic or pre-diabetic, and it's to that degree, I don't think that eating these foods are the reason why you developed SIBO. So how could restricting those foods prevent relapse? What it's going to do is that it's going to manage or quiet down symptoms. So if you do have a relapse of SIBO, you're going to be less aware of that relapse because you have a symptomatic Band-Aid on your hands. And that could be valuable, but it's not the same thing as really preventing a relapse. You could relapse and have SIBO come back again and have very mild to minimal symptoms, but if you're Band-Aiding it with a low FODMAP diet or one of these restricted SIBO diets, you're just going to be relatively none the wiser. And that's, I think, the difference that is important to just mention here. So I do not recommend long-term dietary restriction. If anything, occasionally I will have some patients who really, honest to goodness, need to avoid lactose or fructose or one category or a handful of foods from these categories, but long-term dietary restriction overall is not something that I recommend. But nonetheless, if you pull up, let's see, the link here is the SIBO specific food guide. And if you pull this up, you will see that Siebecker's diet, which she admits on that page, is very restrictive, and she does not recommend going to this one first. She recommends trying other less restricted diets first if you can get away with it. But you can see that she is marrying two different diets. She is marrying together the low FODMAP diet. So you can see that there's a category for low, moderate, and high FODMAP. And then she is also combining it with SCD, which is the specific carbohydrate diet. And you can see that the big no-nos over here in red are going to be the SCD illegal foods. The maybe, but probably not, like a dotted line, are going to be SCD legal, but high FODMAP. And then we get all the way over here to the green zone where they are SCD legal and low FODMAP quantities of these foods. And again, you could see that there are some items on here that would be high FODMAP foods, but she keeps them at a quantity that is manageable. So like beet, 2 slices is low FODMAP. Cabbage, half cup, that's low FODMAP. Even something like, let's say, fennel bulb, for example, or artichoke hearts, those are high FODMAP items, but you can keep them to a lesser quantity so that they're not as triggering for your symptoms and they're not going to exacerbate your bloating and your SIBO symptoms. So I do appreciate that she has that differentiation, because I think sometimes we can get a little bit lost in the weeds with some of these therapeutic diets where this handout makes it look like this is the bad list and this is the good list. Or even with the next one I'm going to show you, it really paints a picture of like bad no-no foods versus, yeah, okay, they're totally fine foods. And I do appreciate that she has some quantities on here that make the diet a little bit more manageable. But you can still see it's fairly restricted, especially if you have a lot of stress and anxiety around a SIBO. Perhaps you've been trying to, heal your SIBO for years and years and years, and you just want to get it done and over with and heal for once and for all. I do find that a fair amount of patients end up sticking with just this green column because it's like they need to really starve it or they need to be extra safe. And few people end up venturing into the yellow and the orange zone from my experience working with patients. Hopefully you're not in that same boat, but I do see a lot of people who just stick with the green zone because we have been conditionally trained to think that green is good, green is safe, green is the best, and then everything else is kind of a no-go. And then you can see that further down the list, she gives you more information. So fruits, similarly, you can see a mixture of genuinely low FODMAP fruits. So for example, citrus, you could see on here, or like papaya. And you could see fruits that are higher FODMAP, but they are at a low enough dose that it shouldn't be problematic. So for example, raspberries, I think the cutoff is about 35 berries. You could see pomegranate. If you eat a whole pomegranate, it would be high FODMAP, but you could see that there is a low FODMAP quantity on here. So I do appreciate that she gives you a fair amount of fruits and vegetables that you're able to eat, albeit in lower quantities. Now, let's go ahead and move on to the biphasic diet. So this is from Dr. Nirala Jacobi. She's out of Australia and is a naturopathic doctor. And this is another quite restrictive diet that honestly, I really don't use. Honestly, I don't really use Siebecker's diet with my patients either. I think it's far too restricted, and it really gets you in this mindset of thinking about quantity a lot. And it's like, it almost makes you think that you have to have this memorized. Like, oh, how many raspberries? 10. Okay, 10. No, not 12, 10. And, oh, how many pieces of passion fruit? Oh, okay, 100 grams. Cool. And it's like, nobody wants to be weighing their food and measuring their food that much and memorizing the quantities of food that are okay for you to eat. So I find that this one gets a little bit complicated, a little bit exhausting, and it's still quite restrictive. So I personally don't really lean on this diet a heck of a lot. But to Dr. Jacobi's credit, this is a very nice handout. It's well laid out. And you can see that the biphasic diet, as the name implies, has 2 phases. You have a phase 1 and phase 2. Both of them are recommended for about 4 to 6 weeks. And I appreciate that she has that right in there. It's meant to be temporary. It's meant to be just like a phase of the healing journey. And then you introduce more foods. And you can see that there is a phase 1A, the restricted phase, and a phase 1B, the semi-restricted phase. So truthfully, I think that she should have called this the quad-phasic diet because there's really 2 phases within each phase. But I didn't name the thing, so I'm not going to give her too much crap about that. So you can see that she gives you a little bit of a breakdown of the different phases. And before we actually talk about the diet itself and the breakdown, I'm just going to point out one of the things that I really like about this handout and Dr. Jacobi's view on this is that she does take a few minutes to talk about other food reactions that could be part of your SIBO story or part of your IBS story. And she outlines particularly histamine intolerance, oxalate intolerance, and salicylate intolerance. And this is not talked about in any of the other SIBO diets. So she's bringing attention to something that is useful for SIBO people to know. What I will share, however, is if you are going to pay attention to one of these things, if there's a likelihood that one of these could be useful for SIBO people, I would hang my hat mostly on histamine. If I had to try to put a number on this, and I have not analyzed my clinical data, but if I had to give a very rough guesstimate, I would say about 20 or 25% of my SIBO and IBS patients have some degree of histamine intolerance. And that's gonna vary. Some people have really, really severe histamine intolerance and mast cell disease, and some people have, a touch of eczema, a touch of, stomach acidity that goes with that. And it's really not too detrimental. But I do find that histamine intolerance is moderately common. It's not the majority, but it is moderately common amongst people with IBS and SIBO. So histamine is the one that you can pay a bit more attention to. Oxalate as a whole is not typically as problematic for my SIBO and IBS patients. It's not that it can't be problematic, but it's really not very common. I would guesstimate somewhere between 2 and 4% maybe of my IBS and SIBO patients have oxalate issues. I have definitely seen oxalate intolerance or oxalate overload cause joint pain, certainly kidney stones. I have seen it cause vulvar pain, and I've also seen both histamine and oxalate. I have seen both of these things cause what seems to be interstitial cystitis, or this feeling like you have a UTI, but you don't have a UTI upon testing. So both of those are worthy of paying attention to if you have those symptoms. But oxalate intolerance is far less common than histamine intolerance in this world of IBS and SIBO. So for what it's worth, I wouldn't stress too much about oxalates. And then salicylates, I don't have as much clinical experience dealing with this, but I have only seen a handful of patients with salicylate issues. I would guesstimate maybe 1% of my IBS and SIBO patients have had issues with salicylates. And I can't really speak much more to that. But I do think that that is the least common out of the 3 that she outlines here. But like I said, if anything, pay a little bit of attention to histamine, especially if you are a more phlegmy, mucousy, allergenic person. And I have numerous videos about histamine and mast cells on this channel that you can check out for that matter. I will also add that the foods outlined here, so this is fairly accurate. Oxalate, beets, almonds, spinach, rhubarb, those are pretty standard high oxalate foods. The histamine thing down here, I disagree a little bit. I've worked with a lot of histamine intolerant and mast cell patients over the years, and a lot of my patients actually do fine with spinach. I don't really consider it to be high histamine anymore. There's a lot of discrepancies amongst low histamine diet lists, and I don't put spinach on the list anymore because a lot of my patients seem to do just fine with it. However, aged meats and bone broth are definitely going to be higher histamine, as well as things like tomatoes, vinegar, oftentimes citrus fruit, and oftentimes tree nuts, and sometimes undercooked or raw egg whites can be very triggering as well, but then cooked ends up being okay. So there's a little bit more to that. And actually, I have handouts about the low histamine diet as well. I'm going to put like a master link down below where you can actually get access to the FODMAP handouts and the histamine handouts. And again, just let me know where to email it, and I'm happy to email you any of those. But anyway, let's go ahead and talk about the actual diet itself. So we'll scroll back up. And you can see that she has outlined this handout to give you the foods that are safe to eat on the restricted diet. So phase 1 of phase 1, if you will. Foods that you can introduce in the semi-restricted phase. So like phase 1B, I guess is what I'll call it. And then foods to avoid until further notice. And you could see, fish, eggs, poultry, meat, all okay. Legumes, she says to avoid, because again, beans and lentils and legumes tend to be pretty high FODMAP, so that's understandable. Dairy, she just has you outright avoid, which is a little bit different than Siebecker's take, and it's a little bit different than the standard low FODMAP. You could see that there are some items like butter and aged cheeses and sour cream and homemade yogurt that are allowed with this hybrid diet. And even with low FODMAP only, there are quite a few dairy products that are low enough in FODMAP content that they would be allowable doing low FODMAP. But on Bi-phasic, she says to avoid dairy. That is one of the strengths of this diet that I think is a little bit better than some of the others, because dairy is a very common food sensitivity. There's a lot of people like me who can't tolerate dairy, but it has less to do with the lactose, the sugar, and it has more to do with the protein. And it can instigate inflammation and leaky gut for those people. So I actually appreciate that she says just, nope, avoid all dairy for the time being. Too risky, too much of a potential inflammatory trigger. For the vegetables, you can see that this is a fairly standard looking low FODMAP list. It's quite restricted. This is more restricted even than just low FODMAP. So it looks a little bit more akin to Allison Siebecker's list, but these are all the ones that you can really have in a great deal of quantity. Similar to Allison Siebecker's list, you can see that she allows 1 spear of asparagus, half a cup of celery root, half a cup of fennel bulb. So these are the moderate to high FODMAP foods that are given in a quantity so as to make them low FODMAP. And as long as you keep them at 1 serving per meal, you're still going to have a low FODMAP meal on your hands. So I appreciate that she has a similar take on that. And she just puts, you can have 1 of these per meal, versus it's a little bit less clear, but theoretically, if you were to use this handout, the Allison Siebecker diet, if you were to use this and you maybe were not super aware of the FODMAP thing, you could inadvertently choose a bunch of foods. So say 1 meal, you're like, okay, I'm going to have 1/4 cup of butternut squash, 5 snow peas, half a cup of fennel bulb, 1 cup of cabbage, and 2 slices of beetroot, all in 1 meal. I mean, you wouldn't, that would be a weird meal. But theoretically, you could eat several different low FODMAP portions of a food and then give yourself enough FODMAP in that meal to perturb symptoms. So it's a little bit less clear with the red, yellow, green styling here, versus the fact that she breaks it up into unlimited quantity vegetables and vegetables to limit to 1 of these per meal. It does help you structure it and keep it genuinely low FODMAP. This is probably the biggest single issue that I have with this particular diet, is the avoidance of fruit in the beginning. And, lemons and limes, I don't. Okay, you get to have a little bit of lemon juice on your salmon, I guess. I do think that this is overly restricted. There are a lot of fruits, even if you look at Dr. Siebecker's protocol here. I mean, you can have bananas, citrus, dragon fruit, durian, grapes, guava, kiwi, melons, passion fruit, even a little bit of pomegranate. Like, there's a lot of options that you could do for fruit. And certainly in the low FODMAP diet, you have this whole column of fruits that are considered low FODMAP and would be perfectly fine doing the low FODMAP diet alone. So Bi-phasic is by far the most restricted when it comes to fruit, from what I have seen at least. So lemons and limes, big whoop-de-freaking do. You're basically eating no fruit for the first few weeks of this restricted phase. And then you can see that we bring in some fruits, but interestingly, a lot of these are higher FODMAPs, like avocado, banana depending on the ripeness, berries depending on which berry we're talking about, cherries are high FODMAP. So it's interesting that there's actually quite a few higher FODMAP items on the list that make it into your diet later on in the elimination. This is my other biggest beef with the Bi-phasic diet, is it's very restricted on grains. She says just avoid all grains, all starch, all complex carbohydrates. And then only in the second part of phase 1, you get to have a little bit of quinoa and a little bit of white rice. As opposed to, on low FODMAP, you can do buckwheat, millet, oats, quinoa, rice, sorghum, teff. There's quite a lot of options there. And then if you take a look at the Allison Siebecker handout, let me see, does she have grains? No, she doesn't have carbohydrates. I guess because so many of them fall. Let's see. Yeah, I guess a lot of them, like potatoes and such, end up being up here. But I guess grains are just off limits in this diet as well because she doesn't weigh in on that. But I think that this is overly restricted. I haven't had a SIBO patient yet say that millet causes problems for them, or overnight oats, or sorghum, or teff, or buckwheat. I really have not seen any issue with my patients with SIBO and IBS from these grains, and they can be important sources of fiber to keep your good microbes healthy and alive. You want to feed those microbes that like those whole grains. So if you want to keep them happy and healthy, I think you would be better to include a little bit more grain than what this diet has. And then the rest of it is moderately straightforward. You can see, she breaks it down: nuts, seeds, oil, etc. And then what ends up happening is, for the second phase of the diet, you basically, phase 2, the first phase of phase 2, ends up being very, very similar to the second phase of phase 1. It should have been quadphasic, I tell you. But you can see that she bolded, like, potato makes an entrance in this phase. This section is almost identical to the less restricted version in phase 1, almost identical to the less restricted version of phase 1 with the addition of rice cakes and rice noodles. So you can see that there's quite a lot of similarities between the phases, but there's this note: avoid until all further notice. So she would have you restrict dairy indefinitely. A lot of these high FODMAP items like onion and garlic, she would just have you avoid possibly indefinitely. The high FODMAP fruits like apples, apricots, mango, persimmon, etc., just avoid until further notice. All of the grains, avoid until further notice. And all of the other legumes and beans. And I think that that is a little bit more restrictive in the long term than what I'm personally recommending for my patients. Like, you should be able to eat most, if not all, of these foods given enough time. So I don't like telling anybody to avoid a food until further notice. I think that that potentially could translate into forever for people, and then that's just like they're on autopilot doing that diet. And you should be able to tolerate most, if not all, of these foods. I'm going to also point out one more thing. I noticed this in phase 1, and I failed to mention it, but on both of the phases for this particular diet, she has you avoid chia seeds, flax seeds, and peanuts. And I can't for the life of me figure out why, beyond the fiber piece of it. But similarly, I have had SIBO patients and IBS patients do actually quite well making like a chia seed pudding, or soaking them, or putting flaxseed meal in a muffin. And it's a really nice way to get some fiber without getting any notable FODMAP content with that fiber. So I don't really know why she has these restricted. I think you should be able to eat those. And then peanuts, I don't know if they are restricted because they can be inflammatory or because they are a legume. FODMAP, let's see. FODMAP-wise, I don't think peanuts end up being commonly problematic. It doesn't look like it, at least. I'm not really seeing it. I put it on the low FODMAP list for my list, at least, which probably means that Monash classifies it as low FODMAP. So I don't know why the peanuts. I don't know if it's a mold thing, if it's an inflammation thing, an allergen thing, because it's a legume. I don't know what the deal is with this, but I do think it's weird, and I don't advise eliminating chia seeds and flax seeds. I haven't seen it necessary in my patient population. Now, let's go ahead and we're going to talk about the last of the SIBO diets, which I personally think is the better of the available diets. I think it's pretty straightforward, and, well, here, I'll just show you. So that is the low fermentation diet from Cedars-Sinai. So this is going to be out of the clinic where Dr. Pimentel works. And, he gives you a little bit of a preface about how the intestines work. This is sort of funny. It's somewhere on here. Let's see. Where is it? All right. This amuses me. I think it maybe paints a little bit of an icky picture, but it is what it is. Think about what we said above. The colon is 3 feet long and only gets trash. The small bowel is 12 feet long and is bathed in fresh, easy-to-use new food. The wording just really cracks me up. Like, trash, that's so harsh. But it is it does have a nugget of truth to it. So if you think about the digestive system, think about, just like small intestine and then colon, right? The good stuff is going to be from, here to here. The good, all of the nutrients, all of the calories, all of the food, all of the fiber. And if a bacteria wants to outcompete other bacteria or potentially outcompete you for calories, it would be very, very wise to sneak up further along the tube and make its home in the small bowel, as opposed to the poor saps that are making their house in the very last part of the colon. Like, they're probably not getting anything. But the closer you can get to the mouth as a bacteria, the more food and the more nutrition you get, and the more you're able to reproduce. So this does paint kind of a funny, cringy picture, but it does make a point that I've mentioned to patients before, which is it's totally logical that your bacteria want to live in the small bowel. It's just that we have ways of preventing that in the human body, because it would be disadvantageous for us to have a lot of bacteria in the small bowel. But it makes total and complete sense from a microbiology perspective. But moving on, you could see some more notes about SIBO, and they talk about the cleansing waves and making sure that you're not snacking. So they make a point of saying don't snack all the time, don't eat right before bed, which I appreciate because I don't think the other handouts really speak to that very much. They give you this nice little graph of easy to digest being sugar, basically, versus more difficult to digest versus things that we cannot digest. So these would be prebiotics, right? The things that we can't digest but the bacteria can are labeled as prebiotics or fibers. So that would make sense over here. And then when we get to the actual dietary restriction, they say multiple times throughout the handout, try to be normal. Try to have some normalcy in your life. Don't make it a big thing. Don't overly restrict. Eat discrete meals, limit snacking, and that way the cleansing waves can occur. And then they make a point to say, avoid the non-digestible carbohydrates. You can have some dairy, just maybe try lactate milk or lactose-free items. Don't drive yourself crazy looking at labels. I really appreciate that he puts that in there. For carbohydrates, simple, easy to digest is best. So this would be like white rice, white potato, kind of the simpler starches perhaps. They even say bread is fine, especially white bread. Sweet potatoes are fine. Nuts are all fine. Chocolate is okay. Breakfast cereal is okay. Pasta's okay. I mean, their version of this ends up being a fairly high carbohydrate diet. But nonetheless, I appreciate that they make that differentiation. They say protein is fine. Fiber, just be careful of some of these fiber sources. They make a point of mentioning gluten, and they say a gluten-free diet is low carbohydrate. That was probably true 10 or more years ago. But now, with gluten-free being so popular, there's gluten-free cookies, gluten-free Pop-Tarts, gluten-free breakfast cereal, gluten-free everything. So now I disagree with this. I do not think a gluten-free diet is intrinsically low carbohydrate, but 10 or more years ago, that was pretty accurate. Protein and fat are okay. Drink plenty of water, minimize soda. And then vegetables, they just put on here, no beans or legumes, no hummus, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cauliflower. Again, these are going to be some of the more high FODMAP vegetables. Mushrooms, they say, are okay. You can eat anything that grows off of a plant, so that opens up a lot more options. Fruits, they basically say apples, pears, and bananas avoid, but all the other fruits are fine. So this ends up being the most freeing of the diets. And they even say some cheat ideas, lactose-free ice cream, hard cheeses, even cheap cakes from the grocery store. That amuses me that they put that, but it's true. I really prefer this diet because they make a point to say, hey, don't drive yourself crazy. It's not worth it. Try to have a social life. Try to enjoy your food. Don't stress about it. They mention that multiple times in the handout. They do reduce enough of the high profile triggery foods that usually there's some symptomatic benefit, but they encourage you to eat practically almost all of the vegetables, practically all fruit, and you still have the opportunity to eat enough fruits and vegetables and fibers to have some microbiome diversity. But as the name implies, it's keeping fermentation a little bit lower so that you can manage your symptoms. And I don't believe this handout actually has anything about killing the SIBO or treating the SIBO. I think that it's really just from the angle of symptom mitigation while you're treating the SIBO with, antimicrobials, antibiotics, prokinetics, whatever it might be. But I really appreciate that there's so much good information in this handout. I appreciate that the diet is not overly restrictive. I appreciate that they do not paint it as good and bad, red and green, legal and illegal. I think that that's a very slippery slope, and it can compromise people's mental health and promote a lot of food fear when we label foods that way. So I really like the Cedars-Sinai diet. If you're going to do a SIBO diet at all, I think that's probably the best one to start with. And then see, do you get any symptom mitigation from that, any symptomatic management? And if so, you can maybe dabble with eliminating a couple more of the high FODMAP foods like onion and garlic. You can play around with layering that a little bit with low FODMAP. But honestly, I tend to tell people to avoid the more restricted diets like the Allison Siebecker diet and the Bi-phasic diet, because they're so restrictive. They're so complicated. They encourage you to overanalyze the crap out of your diet and count grams and count calories and count quantity and track shit. And it makes nutrition really exhausting. That's what ends up being. Both of those diets make nutrition utterly exhausting and not fun. And I think both of them can lead to a lot of food fear and a lot of confusion about what is okay to eat and what is not okay to eat, versus Cedars-Sinai or even low FODMAP, which are pretty apparently meant to be short-term use diets, minimize symptoms, and then try to reintroduce stuff and see how you feel, and then tailor the diet to what you need as an individual. And also, don't lose your damn mind. Don't drive yourself crazy, because then you're going to promote more vagus nerve dysfunction. You're going to be in fight or flight mode all the time. And then guess what? Your motility is not going to work. And then you're going to be saddled with SIBO for much longer than you would hope so. So overall, there are numerous SIBO diets. They all have their time and place, probably. I just tend to go with the least restricted options. So that would be number 1, the Cedars-Sinai low fermentation diet. Number 2 is low FODMAP. And I really hardly ever use the other 2 diets in my clinical practice. I know they're quite popular though, but I don't really encourage them because they are just so difficult to do, and they're exhausting, and it's not good for your mental health, and therefore probably not good for your vagus nerve. So I think that there are other ways that you can go about this with SIBO diets. Or ideally, you shouldn't have to restrict your diet hardly at all. If you really get the motility and the vagus nerve tone going, you should get to a point where you don't need to restrict your diet and you can just eat like a normal human. In the words of Michael Pollan, eat foods, not too much, mostly plants. The goal should be to get to a point where you don't have to think about your diet so much and you can just enjoy food, be a grown-up, eat fruits and vegetables and healthy foods most of the time, and then every now and then live La Vida Loca and go get one of those like cakes from the grocery store or whatever it might be. So guys, until next time, thank you so much for tuning in. And I hope that this helped you understand the different options available to you as far as dietary management of SIBO. Tell me your experience. Have you tried one of these diets or multiple diets? Was one more helpful than the others? Did you get into a reintroduction phase? Or did you wind up feeling quite stuck on one of these diets because it did help you, but then nobody had a conversation of how to get off of the diet? Tell me all the things down below. If you've worked with practitioners, if you've just been figuring this out on your own, I would love to hear your feedback about your experience with SIBO diets and which one has been helpful for you. And if you feel like they have been treating the SIBO, or if you agree with me that they are simply managing symptoms, but ultimately you need to do other things to treat the SIBO itself. So please share in the comments down below. As always, I will see you in the next video, and thank you so much for tuning in. Hey guys, if you like this video, be sure to subscribe, ring the bell, click the like button, and leave a comment down below with the videos that you would like to see me do next. Doing all of those really helps support the channel and support my efforts in making as many videos as possible for you guys. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next video.